Okay, so in this tutorial, I'm going to cover the idea of how to render out a scene using the viewport renderer. So in class, we've talked about the physical render and redshift. Of course, one limitation is that some students don't have redshift to use. I think that would be a speedy and fairly simple way to render things out. But sometimes also, even if you do have redshift, you're like, I need this to render in a few minutes, not several hours to do this. So what I'm going to do is just start with the all boxy scene, right, that we have here, and set this up so that I can render to viewport instead of the redshift. All right, so I'm just going to go through and I'll try to cover some various ways that you could approach this, but also, most importantly, just get you set up with the right output settings. So let's start there. What are the common setups? So let's go under the render settings, and I pull this up. So I have output and save. I have some of these post effects turned on. I'm going to turn off everything actually that I think I had turned on previously as I was messing around with this. So right now we have output. I was rendering this before. It was going from 0 to 510, right? That's the length of the animation. And then underneath save, so if you're outputting using redshift, you always want to render, in fact, I would say you always want to render with single images unless you're doing the viewport render. The viewport render is quick, fast enough, and the whole idea is just to quickly get a preview, right? A QuickTime movie. In some instances, that could be your final render, right? If you use some of these other magic bullet looks and some of these other things. But when you're doing a render that's, several minutes a frame and 500 frames, so it's going to take multiple hours. If your machine crashes or it, runs into a problem, if you're doing a QuickTime movie, you could lose all those frames. If you're doing it just with single images, you would just lose frame 267, and you could start the renderer back up at frame 267 and let it keep going, right? The main thing is that you want to choose whatever your file format is. I would always recommend doing 16-bit depth when you're rendering out individual images, so that you could, if you open it up in After Effects, you could make little changes to the curves or levels or whatever you're doing without having the image degrade too much. The default here is name with the number .tiff, or of course this would be .png when it would save it. So you can just leave that at the default, but what it's going to do is save, my animation 0000.png, my animation 0001.png, and it's just going to keep going. So you have a sequence of images that you could use. Don't worry about the multi-pass image. That's not really important for what we're doing. Okay, so that's if you were just going to use redshift, right? So save, we want to tell it which frames we're going to render out, right? And then we need to tell it where to go. So if this is the file path, I might say, hey, go to movies, and let's create a new folder and call, render catch boxy, right? Whatever bounce. Oops, render catch boxy bounce, right? So this would be a folder, and then I would give it a name of whatever that's going to be, bounce, right? And I would say save. So you can see here it's going to go to users, Dane, movies into this folder, and then it's going to have these. So it's going to be bbounce 000.png, right? Would be that setup. Okay, so that's just for redshift, but we don't want to use redshift. We want to use the viewport renderer as our setup here. You can see already when I changed that, it did some stuff here in the background. I'll talk about that. And we don't want to do a PNG, we want to do MP4 or a movie file. We would still want to save this somewhere, right? So, if you want to, I could just, I'm going to rename this VP for viewport, and I'll just save it into so bbounce VP, is where this would go, right? When I get ready to save it. Now I'm going to do some little tests as this goes along. So I'm going to go back to output. Instead of rendering every single little time this test, I just want to do whatever the current frame is as I build this up. Now, there is a way to set up all your settings here in the viewport and then transfer those over into the render settings. But I find that it's just a little confusing just because you have to go down in here to this menu to configure and yada, yada, yada. I'm just not going to deal with that right now. So we'll just set it up doing little mini test renders, right? So I have this set up to, oops, and I'm going to change the size. I have this set up, well, I don't know. I'll leave it this big size, right? 1920 by 1080, right? A full 1080 p render size. If you want to change the size, this was underneath screen. So output, screen, and this is for any render, right? How big do you want it to be? I think your default's going to be 1280 by 720, but you know, what the hell? Let's go with, where'd it go? Oh, this one would be under film and video, HDTV 1080 is that preset. Obviously there's so many different screen sizes. We could manually put this in if we needed to, but I'm just going to leave it where it is. So 1920 by 1080. We're just going to render the current frame, and I'm just going to turn off save for now. I don't want to really save the frame. I just want to do a little test. So if I render using the viewport settings, I get something that looks exactly like what's in the viewport, right? And this is not very appealing. It has several problems. So let's work forward to address that. The first thing, if I go back to the render settings here, is if I have viewport render, if I click on it, it has two tabs in here, right? So we have basic and we have filter. So let's go ahead and turn one thing on. I'm going to turn on shadows. Now, if you're not using lights, this is not going to work for you, but I already have a redshift light in here, and I think Cinema 4D will interpret that. You could also put Cinema 4D lights in here. I'll show you how to do that as well. The shadow down here has a map size. I'm just going to leave it at the default now. I'm going to leave it I'll just leave it there. We can increase the size to get better resolution if we run into problems. I'll talk about that later. But for now, let's just turn that on. Reflections are turned on. I'm also going to turn on depth of field because I think that helps the image look a little bit better. We'll set that maybe here in a minute. Then the other thing is filter. So when I click on filter, these are all the things that I can show or not show in the render. And sometimes you might want to show like where the lights exist in this editor view or where the deformers are, but I don't want to see any of that, right? I want to see this as if it was kind of a lo-fi final quality render. So there's a nice little option here, just geometry only. If I turn that on, that just takes everything out of the mix other than the geometry. And if I do, again, just put the render to picture viewer, you can see that I already have a little image is a little bit better, right? It has a couple of problems here. One, this is too dark. You probably will not see this, but I'm going to fix this in a second. It's because I was using a special material. It also, with the stage I was using in that scene, I had turned on the grid so that you could see some distances as you were animating, but I'll turn that off. It also has this weird anti-aliasing. Well, I guess it's not anti-aliased, right? It has the jaggies, right? We're going to fix that here in a second. So let's go down the list. The first thing is I have a cloner here in the background that's got these boxes, right, to just give a background. And I was using what's a node material. The node material doesn't work with the viewport editor. You all were not really using that, so you don't have to worry about it. But I'm just going to put a redshift ground plane material on this. This is the material that I was using for the floor, right? So I now get shading, so that solves that problem. Again, I can't imagine how you were using a node material, so that's not going to be a problem. If I go into the stage group, the cylinder object down here, I had put a little tag on it. So this is only this is only relevant if you or using the scene that I had created, right? If you had the stage object and the redshift sun and sky in there. So if I go to that cylinder and the tag for it, I had this alternate shading mode turned on for the tag. I'll just turn that off so it doesn't show the lines, right? So let's see what I get now. Right, so this is already infinitely better. The other thing too is you can see that I have a shadow is happening in the scene. It's actually a decent quality shadow. This is coming from Redshift. Now, I haven't used the Redshift shadows in here with the viewport render. So I'm not sure exactly how that map size works. It looks like I can see a little bit of jaggedness here. There's a little bit of jaggedness there. So we'll close that. Let's go back to the setting. So the light, actually, there's an area light up here, up above. I'm not sure, where is this other light coming from? What else do I have here? Oh, this is my redshift sun that I have set up there. I'm not actually sure if that does anything in the viewport render. I'm going to turn it off. Let's do a little test and see if it does. Yeah, it doesn't. It's not going to make a difference, right? I don't know if you'll be able to tell though, but there is just a little bit of blotchiness, I guess, in the shadow itself. It might be from the anti-aliasing, but it's probably because of the size of that shadow map that's being drawn. So I'm going to turn this to 2048. Just going to double that. This will go all the way up to, I think the max is 4096. So it's just doubling in this little binary. Yeah, I can already tell that that's better. The map sizes, or the map is cleaner, right? Okay, so I'll just leave that there. So this is already pretty decent. I'm also going to show, let's go back to the display. So we've been using the ground shading. If I turn this with lines, you can see that I get the whole shading with the wireframe on there. That's probably not what we want, right? I can also go to quick shade. And that looks okay too, but it doesn't give me any shadows. So if you want shadows to show up, you're going to have to use the ground shading, right? All right, that's not bad. I'll go with that. So let's deal with so we fixed the material back here. We now have a decent shadow that's happening. The last thing here is this anti-aliasing, right? That's going on. So where's my little thing? I have depth of field turned on. Oh, let's anti-alias the depth of field. There's only just a little bit of that happening. I could tweak that if I want. But in the viewport render underneath basic, this is where the anti-aliasing is happening. I'll turn on transparency. I don't think that has any bearing on the little eyeball, but just in case. Okay, so under the anti-aliasing, we can tell it, basically this is like the sample size. Don't worry about it too much. Just know that none is worse and 8 is better, but slower. And then the sampling that it puts across here. So I'm just going to do 4 as the anti-aliasing set, and the super sampling, I'm just going to put it up to 8. You know, I could put it to 16. I don't think I'm going to need that, and it will just slow things down a little bit. So let's go ahead and just render that. Oops, did it render? Let me close this. Right, so you can see it took a little more time, but now those edges look pretty clean, right? This looks pretty smooth to me. This is not a bad setup, right? This is pretty good. It is a little dark though, right? So if you're trying to even out the lighting, the best trick that I can suggest, let's go back here. That's my cat in the background, by the way. Is let's create a couple lights, Cinema 4D lights. So this would be the last thing as far as doing that render output. So let's go up to the lighting menu and let's just choose an infinite light, right? So these are Cinema 4D lights. We can mix these in the viewport. And this light, as its default, it doesn't have a shadow turned on, which is actually good. We don't want any new sets of shadows coming from this. But you can see the direction that it points affects the amount of lighting that you have in the scene, right? So I'm just going to position this one like so, right, to lighten the scene a little bit. And I can turn down the intensity. I could also change the color. Like maybe I'm going to use temperature, actually. I want this to have kind of a bluish cast to it. And maybe I just turn this down, or I don't know, just leave it close to 100%. That's pretty good. And I'm going to duplicate that light. And I'm going to take this one and just point it a slightly different direction. If I want to, I could duplicate it one more time, right? And maybe just point it from maybe over here. The main thing is, and maybe I'll turn that one down a little bit, the intensity. And let's take the one that was below, turn its intensity down a little bit too. Okay, so what I'm doing is just pointing light going in these different directions. And again, the position of an infinite light, which is what we've created here, the type is called infinite. It's kind of like a sun, right? It's millions and millions of miles away, so its location doesn't matter. It's just the angle that it that it's pointing, right? So if I move it, it doesn't change anything here. Let's do, right? So that doesn't change any of the lighting. It's just the direction that it's pointing, right? So already that looks pretty good. Let's go to I think I have the camera in there. Let me see if I do physical, that's set. Let me turn that off there. And objects, I think I have that focus distance selected. Okay, so I went and lowered the depth of field. It's not perfect depth of field, right? It's a little bit of a cheat, but it's not bad as I'm setting that. So to do that, let's go back. So I have a camera. Underneath its physical properties, I can set the f-stop, right? So this is how much, smaller numbers mean more stuff will be out of focus. Higher numbers, which actually corresponds to a smaller opening in the camera aperture, which is weird to say it that way. But the larger numbers, even though that's not really a larger number, it's a fraction. But in this case, that larger number means more stuff is going to be in focus. And, I could turn that on here in the viewport. I could say, you know what, let's turn on the depth of field so I could see it, maybe as I'm setting that. And I could, be like, yeah, 2, that looks a little bit better on the aperture. I don't need as much in that setting. There's a little bit of blurring here in the background. Just to go to the final step, I'm just going to crank that super sampling, everything up to its highest setting, and see what we get here. Also do the same thing with the shadows. 40, 96. Now, the shadow map, where the light is and how big your scene is, if you have an enormous scene, the map size, you can get to the point where it's not big enough. And what you'll have is shadows that look kind of jagged. If you are having issues with that, just email me. We can talk about some strategies. But in this case, I have kind of a small little scene. It's pretty contained, and I'm going to get, in fact, I can go back up here again underneath the options and say, hey, show me the shadows in the scene, and I already get a sense of what this is looking like, right? Okay, so I have shadows, I have decent shading, I've got little depth of field, I've got this set up, and if I want to, well, let's just do a single frame render again. So it took 6 seconds, right? But the image quality looks decent. It actually would be, I blew this up to 200%, so it looks really clean like this. Cinema 4D's picture viewer kind of has a hard time dealing with the retina displays and stuff. So this looks pretty good, right? And this would be a fine way to fire off the render. And again, at this point, I would just go back to the output. Well, let's go to save. I would say, let's turn save on. If I need to, I would click on this and say, hey, I'm going to save to my movies folder, bbounce VP, right? For viewport render is what I'm going to call it. It's going to be an MOV file, 8-bit. I don't need 16. And I want to do all frames, whatever I had in here. No, I actually wanted it to be, I think 510 is where the characters come out this side there. So now I can just press render to picture viewer. So this is, and again, I put the settings to the complete max. I don't know if I actually need the complete max to make this work, but it's not bad, right? And so this will take, I don't know, 20 minutes. It's doing it, you can see at the bottom there, 3 seconds per frame. And my characters don't come in till I think like frame 20. Maybe we'll wait long enough just to see that, but let me just recap. So you can have setups where you're using Cinema 4D or Redshift lights. So those lights will all work in the Viewport render if you have shadows turned on for them. If you're using the Cinema 4D lights, remember, if you do want shadows, you have to turn them on. As a default, it won't be on if you're using a point light or a spotlight or the infinite light that I just used. In that case, if you are using the infinite, in fact, actually, I don't think the infinite light in the Viewport renderer will give you the correct kind of shadows. So what you would want to use is a spotlight for that. Yeah, so in the Viewport settings, just tell it geometry only. That will turn off everything that we don't want to see inside the scene. Here come our little characters. But this is not bad as far as the look and the setup, right? And this would be a great way to turn in your animation. This will work with the stage object, so the stage object will do all the camera switches that you would need inside the thing. All right, these are all with Redshift materials on them as well, so that's translating in the scene. I think that's what I have set up there. Yeah, I do. These are all Redshift materials. Right? And again, you can see that this is a little bit slower. I'm not sure if I would, I put those settings all the way to the top of the roof. Let's go back to the Viewport render and let's just make this 4 and 4x4, so it's a little bit smaller. Yes, we're gonna save over the movie. And you can see that sampling, it made the edges just a little bit cleaner. I can see a little bit of aliasing going on here, but now it's just ripping through frames, right? It's not even a second per frame as it's rendering this out, right? So it's very quick. Okay, maybe what I'll do is turn this back on here in a minute and with the full settings and post this movie to Blackboard so you can see it for yourself. Okay, those are the render settings. Hope that helps.